Hi and welcome to my channel. My name is Patience, and in this video I'm going to be talking about 5 things I wish I knew before moving to Zimbabwe from South Africa. So just a brief background. I lived in South Africa for just almost a decade, and then after that we decided to come back to Zimbabwe. So when we moved to South Africa, we had 2 children who were not yet in school. They hadn't started primary school, but they were in creche. So when we moved, they couldn't speak English. So when we got to South Africa, we had to teach them how to speak English so that they could get into at least an English-speaking kindergarten school. So we did that. That went well. They started speaking English. So because we wanted them to be able to communicate at school, we made sure we kept speaking to them in English until a point where they could not remember how to speak Shona. Well, maybe they remember it, but they didn't speak Shona anymore. So after that, they were now speaking English, and we were okay with that, At that point, we didn't think of the consequences of what would happen if we decided to move back to Zimbabwe, etc. And we were not planning to come back then, so we just kind of shelved that whole thing and never even thought about it until it was actually time to move back to Zimbabwe. So when we moved to Zimbabwe in 2023, one of my main concerns was, are my children going to be able to cope? Because when we moved, we didn't want to spend a lot of money taking our children to private schools because we didn't have a lot of money saved up. So if we had taken them, if we were going to take them to private schools, then that would mean most of our money would just, end up being depleted before we figure out how we were going to make ends meet. So we decided to put them in government schools. They were learning in Glenview 1. Yes. So at first I was a little hesitant because they couldn't communicate and they were in a high density suburb. Not that there's anything wrong with high density suburbs, but when you're in an environment and you cannot speak the language that everyone else is speaking in that environment, then things become a little bit difficult. So for my children, it was I'm sure it was really hard because I remember my child, who by then was starting grade 6 in 2023, she would come home crying, saying, "Mama, my teacher, when she's teaching, sometimes she speaks in Shona, even when it's not a Shona lesson. So I do not understand what you'll be saying." I had to say to her, because when we left for South Africa, I sat her down. When we left for South Africa, they were speaking Shona, they could not speak English. I sat her down and I said to her, "You know what? When we left for South Africa, you could speak Shona. So Shona is somewhat there within you. You have to search within yourself. And I'm sure things are going to be a little bit easier." It was not easy for me as a mom to, say something like that to a child who's only in grade 6. The other one, who was in grade 4 by that time, was not really having a very stressful time coping with learning how to speak Shona, etc. Anyway, fast forward, it took something like a year for them to learn how to speak Shona. So by the time my daughter, who was then writing grade 7 in 2024, was now writing exams, she could speak Shona, she could write Shona compositions. Even the teacher was impressed. And by the way, the teacher was working extra hard. She had to start teaching her from grade 1 concepts of how to speak Shona, and I even had to take the one who was in grade 4 to the same Shona lessons that my grade 7 daughter was doing with her teacher, because she was teaching them concepts from grade 1 on how to speak Shona. So thankfully, my children quickly grasped the concepts, and they managed to be able to speak Shona in just a year. So the one who was starting preschool was okay. I mean, he's a carefree guy. He was 5 by then. He didn't mind learning how to speak Shona. He didn't seem bothered. He was not affected. He quickly managed to speak Shona. And another thing that I did was that because we were staying in a high density suburb, right? I mean, a high density suburb. I would tell them to go and play on the street with the other kids because children would play on the street, especially if it was school holidays. Children would be playing on the street, playing all sorts of games, running around, shouting in Shona, and all those things. So that was a big plus for them. I think that really helped them to be able to catch on really fast. And then, so if you're worrying about bringing your children home and they can't speak Shona, don't worry. Children really pick up fast, especially if they're in a government school, if you're in a high density area, and if that will be the scenario. I'm talking from my own experience. My children really picked up on how to speak Shona really quickly. So I think if you're worried about that, and if I knew that children pick up really quickly, I was not really going to, spend a lot of time worrying about that. So, secondly, the other thing that I wish I knew when I was planning on coming back to Zimbabwe is that if you put a child in government school, they still learn. You know, for my own, if from my own experience, we, like I said earlier, we do not want to spend all our money taking our children to private schools and then not know exactly how we're going to survive. So then we put them in government schools, all three of them. By then they were all in primary school, so we put them in a government primary school. Luckily, it was so close to our house, so they would just walk to school like maybe 3 minutes if they walked fast, maybe 8 minutes if they walked slow. That's the time it would get them to get to school, and so they wouldn't even have to cross any major main roads to get to the school. So then they managed to, um, pick up really quickly. And the one who was even writing grade 7 national exams even managed to pass. She managed to get 8 units in her exams, and it was not even difficult when we were looking for a Form 1 place for her because she had passed. So if you are not rich and you want to put your child in government school, go right ahead, whether it's a boarding school or a day school. My children are in day school and they managed to, catch on really quickly. And yes, even up to now, they're still in government school. I realized if they're in government school and they're learning, I'm not yet, that rich. So I'm not going to be putting them in private school right now, but definitely in the long run, if finances permit, then I'll definitely transfer them and um, put them into a private school. And then if you are worried about transporting your things from South Africa, I mean things like your beds, your washing machines, if you've got any form of equipment, my husband does welding, so he's got welding machines. I do baking, I've got bakery mixers and things like that. If you're worried about transporting your things, you can use those people who they call Malaicha. I don't know what that means. I'm sure it's not even a Shona word. You can use those people to transport your stuff to Zimbabwe, and then they'll get your things home. But I used those people because I thought the buses were going to be very expensive. But because we traveled when it was not the peak of any season, it wasn't Christmas, it wasn't Easter, we actually traveled in January after people had actually gone back to work. I think it was around mid-January of 2023. That's when we traveled back to Zimbabwe. So I was surprised. I thought we were going to have to pay bus fare for all five of us because there's myself, my husband, and then my three kids. I thought we were going to have to pay bus fare for all five of us, but then we ended up having to pay for three of us, and then the other two didn't even pay because the bus driver and the conductors were like, no, actually, you can come. There are no people on the bus, so you can come, and then you only pay for three, and then the others will even be sitting on the seats. And then I also realized that the trailer of the bus was not even full. But I'd already sent my things with the guy, with the Malaysia guy, to bring my things to Zimbabwe. And then I ended up being disappointed because the guy took 6 months to get to Zimbabwe with my stuff. Got here with some of my things broken, some of my things missing. There was not much I could do to him because then he ended up sending other people to say, I'm busy, but then here are your things and things like that. I was quite disappointed, but at first I thought things had been stolen, but once they arrived, I was like, at least I got something out of my things, and not all my things disappeared. So, yeah, that was the other thing. So the last thing I wish I knew before coming back to Zimbabwe is that people are not, really all up in people's business. I was really worried because I was thinking everyone is going to be looking at me saying, "Oh, she was in South Africa. What does she have to show that she was there? What is she doing with her life?" And things like that. Even if I was staying in a high density area, I was staying in Glenview when we first got back to Zimbabwe from South Africa. I was staying in Glenview and at my in-laws' house. And after staying in South Africa, I absolutely loved Glenview because in South Africa we never really stayed in in a high density area. So being back in Zimbabwe and staying in a high density area, having to go and fetch water at the public borehole, it was all new to me, and I absolutely enjoyed it. Hearing stories of what the other person up the road is doing, and things like that. So instead of people asking me what I was up to and things like that, no one really cared, really. People do ask, maybe over the first like 3 weeks of you getting back, they ask you, you're back. How was it in South Africa? So what are you up to? Are you going back? They ask things like that. But that should be the least of your worries because people are just, minding their own business. And so if I knew that people actually don't even mind what I wear, if they do mind, they never even told me that, oh, what are you wearing? I thought you were in South Africa. Nobody ever said that. And so if I knew that people actually don't really mind, I was not going to have as many sleepless nights as I had before traveling back to Zimbabwe from South Africa. So basically, yes, those are the 5 things that I wish I knew before traveling back to Zimbabwe from South Africa. So if you're in South Africa and you're a Zimbabwean, you want to come back home, go for it. I mean, it's nice here. For me, I find it very, it's so heartwarming to be back home. Well, maybe because I was away for so many years, but I really feel happy here. I have no short-term plans to leave the country, whether to go to South Africa or any other country. I would rather, find a way of going across Samora and living in the north of Harare, or even in other smaller towns like Chipinge. At some point in my life, I was in Chipinge. I loved Chipinge. People say a lot of stuff about Chipinge, but I absolutely loved Chipinge. I wouldn't mind staying in a city like that. So I don't know. Maybe going as I go on with my life, maybe I'll think of leaving the country. But so far, so good. I'm enjoying Zimbabwe. So if you're planning on coming back home, go right ahead. I'll be rooting for you. So yes, thank you so much for watching this video. If you watched till the end, thank you so much. Please like and subscribe. I hope to see you again in my other videos that I'll be posting. I'll be posting a lot of other different videos. If there's something else that you'd like to know about my move from South Africa to Zimbabwe, please post in the comments down below, and then I will probably do a video especially for you. Thank you. Stay blessed.